Welcome to the SOTA Symposium. Today we're going to talk about social data science and collective resilience, opportunities and challenges. We have two great speakers and the moderator. Logistically, the way we'll do things today is using the Q&A. So on your bottom of your screen on the right, there'll be the Q&A icon. You can click on that. You can ask questions throughout the talk. And then after the presenters are done, Susanna, the moderator, will kind of draw from your questions and lead a discussion with the presenters. So with that, I want to hand off to Susanna Palance, who's a faculty member at the College of Information Studies at the UMDI School and associate at Arliss, and has done all sorts of things with measurement, and actually was an earlier presenter in an earlier SOTA Symposium. So I'll hand it off to Susanna.
Thank you, Brian. Everyone can hear me. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, who is Chris Mahoney. He is a lawyer and a political economist who has worked on the utility of emergent data sources in areas such as new financing operations. He's done work at the World Bank, and during his 17-year career, he served as a strategic policy and rule of law advisor and global focal point on transitional justice at the United Nations Development Program in New York. He was also the founding deputy director of the New Zealand Center for Human Rights at Auckland Law School. He's taught courses at Oxford, Peking University, at Auckland University. He also, in 2008, directed the design of Sierra Leone's Domestic Witness Protection Program. And earlier than that, in 2003, he worked in Sierra Leone and Liberia on their Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. He is the CEO and co-founder of Peloria, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Peloria is a small organization which is interdisciplinary and international, where they look at basically using new data sources to understand the relationship between influential actors' language and real-world violence. Did I cover that? Is there anything else you'd like me to add, Chris? Or?
No, that was very, very generous. Yeah, okay. And reasonably so. Thank you so much, Susanna.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go dark so Chris can give his talk.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll share my my screen here first. We'll just do a couple of introductory slides here to introduce Peloria, the leadership, where it came from. First, of course, thank you to Jody, Brian, and colleagues at the University of Maryland, firstly for taking an interest in this important subject, and secondly for giving me the opportunity to speak to yourselves and your colleagues and the broader audience to engage with academia, because that's really what we benefit enormously from, right, is critique of what we're doing so that we can do it better, because as I'm sure we'll get to, we're in an unregulated or under-regulated space. And what that means is we have to set the rules and the constraints for ourselves. And that's difficult as a startup on the resource side, and also in terms of ensuring across disciplinary vetting of what, why, how, with whom we do what we do. So our leadership comprises of myself from the sort of legal and political economy, developmental economics background, our chief data scientist, Professor Rohini Srihari, from the data science background, Professor Eduardo Albrecht, who is an anthropologist by training and teaches anthropology still. And we came to know one another via a joint United Nations World Bank report called Pathways for Peace, and I was one of the contributing authors to that. And part of my portfolio was to identify knowledge gaps that we have in identifying the drivers of violence across different contexts. One of those, of course, is how we observe and even measure the extent to which individual actors mobilize social group specific grievances about the extent to which social groups perceive they are excluded from access to justice and security political participation, access to public services, access to land and resources as examples amongst many, and how individuals mobilize those grievances towards violence or away from it. And so what the report to some extent calls for is a more rigorous science-based attempt to observe and measure the multidimensional and compounding nature of different factors of risk, how pre-existent factors of risk are affected by what we might call exogenous shocks, like a significant economic change, the introduction to the security context of an invading or an emerging armed group, for example, and then how we draw on both orthodox sources of data as well as unorthodox sources of data that indicate human behavior, as well as change in what we call real phenomena across the social world, including culture, the economy, as well as the natural world. So that's all your climate, environmental, ecological factors, and the built world. So infrastructure, where roads are, where streetlights are, right across these spheres of a context. And how do we do that? We have to then think about the types of risk, and from a multidisciplinary perspective, engaging with historians, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, security studies experts, development economists, criminologists. We attempt to identify what the factors we think we know are associated with change, and whether it's different forms of violence, social unrest related supply chain disruption, change in levels of poverty, change in levels of migration, or even forced displacement, and what that therefore means for what phenomena we attempt to represent, therefore what data we collect, how we curate that data, and then how we design our experiments, whilst also at the same time attempting to be conscious of the potential ethical, rights, and governance implications of what we do. So here you can see a kind of hypothesization of what we might do in one context, right? Where we might be focusing on one sort of dependent variable or another, how we conceive of the different phenomena associated with that. And then, where we might look, obviously this is a very narrow set of potential data sources, but where we might look to try to capture both change in reality in a context and change in perceptions of reality. So what I'll do now is I'll share with you an example where we have developed a model, one of our models, and we've visualized it for a client, right? And this is in Kenya, where we are able to forecast with an average level of accuracy of 89%, increases and decreases in 3 different forms of violence across 4 territories. So all of Kenya, the Rift Valley region of Kenya, this is the capital region of Kenya, and this is the coastal region of Kenya. And we do it across 7 different look-ahead periods. So in effect, there's 12 different predictions, 3 forms of violence across 4 territories, right? But then there's 7 different predictions for across 7 look-ahead periods for each of those configurations of violence and territory. So if you take the average of all the look-ahead periods across all the configurations of violence and territory, we achieve 81% accuracy still. So here you can see it's set on all of Kenya for armed conflict and terrorist attacks, but I can change this to riots and protests. And you'll see, because riots and protests are more voluminous, we do very well in our predictive accuracy in predicting increases or decreases. I've set this to August 2nd so that I'm not putting in the public domain predictions from today or within 120 days of today. But we have predictions ongoing for Kenya right now that the client can access, and they can see levels of increase or decrease. They can select, they can check whether we got it right. It's completely accountable. We're not predicting data that we ourselves generate. As I'm sure many of you will know, there are a number of different social unrest and violence databases out there that one can use, and we use one of them. And so they can go to one of those databases and check, okay, how close to 99 events over 120 days from August 2nd of last year were we? And of course, we also list the number of events that occurred in the preceding same number of days prior to the date upon which the predictions were made. And so this model is ingesting economic data. It's ingesting climate and environmental data. It's ingesting demographic data, political risk data, even Google search trends data. Then it also ingests language sentiment about all the phenomena that are associated with change in levels of violence in Kenya. And then we're also able to engage in what is sort of colloquially called explainable AI. So that is an approach where we identify what configurations of factors, both real and perceived, are most associated first historically with change in these different forms of violence, but also contemporaneously. So the client gets bi-weekly an update as to what those factors are. But as I said, they could either go to the website of the one of the data sets that we're predicting, or we list it for them, right? So they can come here and they can see the number of events that have occurred broken down to the day, right? Whether it's armed conflict and terrorist attacks, riots and protests, or political and extrajudicial violence, again, across the 4 territories. And they can zoom in and out on any of these temporally on any day or week or month. For example, they can do the same thing with sentiment, positive sentiment, negative sentiment, and what we call momentum. So that's the volume of sentiment about the topics associated with increases and decreases in violence. So they can see generically, and then that can inform the more sophisticated and precise inquiries that we can then explore as to what configurations and under what relationships are local dynamics, are the existing local dynamics that are driving change in violence contemporaneously. So then we can also go to one of these sources and search through within that source. So I'll show you this now, but we don't actually, again, for ethical rights and governance reasons, we actually do not allow our clients to access this capacity, right? So we are able to aggregate and anonymize online language that is most associated with decline in levels of violence, and provide that to the client. But because of the sort of surveillance power of this, we don't provide a carte blanche to the client, because of course we as a company don't have the capacity to make determinations about how, under what circumstances, why, when a client might be using our capacity. So if I click on descending order here, then it will, and then I click submit, then it will search through all these millions of tweets and identify those individual tweets and the Twitter handles most associated with increase and decrease in violence. But I can search more narrowly, right? So just negative sentiment about particular topics, right? And the experts across disciplines that we engage with also identify in a situation which individual actors or entities are the most influential in that society. So here you have political parties, you have politicians themselves, you see all the governors there, the members of parliament, you have businesses, business leaders, all the way through to radio show hosts, religious leaders. And I could just select any configuration of these actors, or I could select all of them, and then I can search all the millions of tweets. I just click submit. So this will all change, and it will list from top to bottom those tweets whose negative language sentiment about governance, identity, crime, and public health is most associated with change in levels of violence, right? So then once I've done that, I can then go and look, okay, so we already have this, but then we can go and look at under what configurations of change in reality, whether it's commodity prices, business to business data, macro fiscal indicators, proxies for unemployment, for migration, temperature data, rainfall data, soil moisture data, you know, all the data sources I'm sure many of you are familiar with that we use in natural disaster related risk financing operations, whether it's in the private sector or in international financial institutions like the bank. So we don't provide access to this. We do provide access to findings, and here you can see that there's, you know, of course we give the key findings, we give a description of our methodological approach that's sufficient for publication, but doesn't go to the proprietary dimensions of what we do. And then they can search, the client can search through and look through any of these 12 configurations of violence and location, right? So you have your 3 forms of violence and your 4 locations, and you can look at, you know, for example, riots and protests just in the capital region, and you can see over the 7 different look-ahead periods, the level of accuracy that is achieved, as well as the confidence intervals, as well as broken down to if we're predicting a decrease as opposed to an increase, and then, you know, the number, you know, for the quant people or the data scientists amongst you, then, you know, the number of different events, whether increase or decrease, you know, over the preceding number of days, so that you can see that we're not just predicting an event that's commonly occurring. I think I'm up against time. Hopefully I'm within the 15 minutes there, Susanna. I'll hand back to you, because of course from our perspective, selfishly, it's always we always benefit more as well from hearing from yourselves and the Q&A and the critique of what we do, how we're doing it. But thanks for the opportunity.
No worries. I am going to now introduce Professor Sarah Oates, and then after Professor Oates's talk, I'll moderate the Q&A. So please definitely keep the questions coming when you think of them, and we will get to them for the last third. So Dr. Oates has been studying Russian media and Russian propaganda for the past 25 years and has published widely on how the media subverts or supports democracy in a range of countries. She has a recent book, Revolution Stalled: The Political Limits of the Internet in the Post-Soviet Sphere by Oxford University Press. And she analyzes the potential of the internet to bring political change in Russia. She holds an MA and a PhD in political science from Emory University and is a professor and senior scholar at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism here at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is also the co-developer of Propaganda IQ, which she will discuss. And that's a software application that combines human coding and machine learning to identify specific news narratives.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Susanna. And she didn't mention that Susanna and I share a past of growing up at Duke University, where both our parents were professors.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm going to turn my timer on, and I'm going to ask if people can see my presentation. Just maybe Susanna give a shout out, or okay, Brian's saying yes. I put the link. Great. I put the link in the chat, and I've turned on my stopwatch, but Susanna or Brian or anyone just leap in front of me if I go on too long. So I'm going to talk academics, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey, although I'm so impressed with Peloria and what the company does. And it's just a great segue into talking about these issues more generally, because I'm going to talk about the line between artificial intelligence and augmented intelligence. And I'm going to sort of take you on a journey of thinking about how we can take where we are and get to where we need to go using artificial intelligence or using machine learning, because it's taken me a while to kind of figure this out. Oops, so let me get on the right screen to advance, and that's just me. Okay, so I've been a coder for 25 years, but not in the way you would think. So I am a content analysis specialist. So this is analog. I actually do use digital. So mostly what I do is I hold a timer and I watch television programs. This is not mine. This is just an example of sort of how content analysis works. So you're measuring the number of words or the length of inches of a newspaper article. You're measuring the minutes devoted to a particular topic on television news. And I look almost exclusively at news. So I can tell you fun things. I can tell you how much time was devoted to pro-Kremlin parties on Russian TV in 1993 and 1995. Probably the only person in the world who can tell you that. I can, a lot of time, this was back with VHS, so that made it challenging. I can tell you how Fox News compares with other networks in the coverage of the 2004 election. I can talk to you about Russian citizens and how they frame talking about issues online when it comes to health problems. And I can compare the amount of time that news in the United States, Britain, and Russia focuses on terrorism and the different ways they talk about it. So that's the fundamental basis of my work. My work looks at news narratives. And I've spent a surprisingly large amount of my time in my life clutching a stopwatch and watching TV. It's also rendered me completely incapable of watching news at all, because all I do is analyze. And I think I said this, but if I didn't, the link to this presentation is in the chat, and you can click on it yourself or follow along. So I've spent the last 5 years working on how can AI help me to do content analysis? So I am sort of outmanned and outgunned by the speed and scale of the way in which news is delivered in the digital world. So I have partnered up with some people. I've tried to get up to speed on how can a computer do what I do. So how can a computer code news, basically, to get down to it. So I'm inspired by Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue in my way of thinking about this. And I actually, a colleague at Marvelous AI, Olya Gorovich, mentioned this to me and as a really interesting way to think about artificial intelligence. So he, of course, is the Russian chess grandmaster, and he was the one who first played the IBM's Deep Blue. And as he points out in his book, Deep Thinking, he initially could beat the computers, but it was very, very hard. And he knew he would reach a time when the computers would be able to beat him at chess. But he does point out that one thing computers and robots still can't do is easily walk around a chess hall and go to different boards physically. So there's things that computers can do, and we can embrace that without being afraid that it will somehow replace it, because in tandem, it can bring us to better places. And for him to say that when his whole identity is about being able to beat anyone or anything at chess, it's quite amazing. So I take, and this is his book, I take some inspiration for this. So we live in this era of artificial intelligence, or AI, and we don't really understand the potential or limits of AI unless you watch a lot of science fiction movies, which I do. And this is, of course, Terminator, which pushes the idea that eventually AI will somehow subsume humanity. It won't make it better. And that's actually a rather dominant paradigm in some ways. But in reality, so artificial intelligence is the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. And I'm doing the terrible professor thing of reading the thing that's right in front of you. Whereas augmented intelligence suggests that cognitive technology is designed to enhance rather than replace human insight. And I couldn't have a better example than of Chris's work and Chris's company, because that's exactly what they're doing. Yes, there are elements there that are automated, but what lies at the heart of that is the intelligence, not the artificial and not the computer. So that's what I'm striving to do in my work. So I want to enhance rather than replace. And I think as we're all moving forward and we're looking at the Soda Center and we're thinking about ways that we can work collaboratively, I think it's really important to be comfortable with the idea of evolving as scholars, of saying that, yes, you know, I've always been the content analysis person. I've always been the one who's come in and solved this particular problem of, you know, how is this content divided among different topics? And it's really important for me to feel inspired rather than threatened by the promise of artificial intelligence, of machine learning. And it's been an interesting journey over the past couple of years. And I would say, you know, we talked about this coming back to the idea of resilience when we put out the marketing for this particular symposium. And I would argue that understanding news narratives, understanding how news travels in our contemporary media ecosystem is one of the most important questions we need to understand and answer in society. Well, of course I'd say that. I'm a professor at a journalism college, but quite seriously, looking back over the past 5 years and thinking about the way that information is so important for the health of society, for the literal health of society right now in terms of vaccines, you know, I would say that this is a question that you should deploy absolutely every effort you can to answer. So I let go of my fear to a degree, and there's some fabulous people at the University of Maryland, including people in the iSchool, where I gave some early presentations on this, Philip Resnick in the computer science department. And I partnered up with a computer science PhD student named Joseph Barrow, and we wound up co-designing Propaganda IQ. And that's what it looks like. So if you were to open it on a computer, and he coded it. It's actually now part of his dissertation, which is really, really cool. And for a social scientist to be cited in a PhD dissertation is just very exciting for me. But so what Propaganda IQ does is it pulls down using keywords. Say you wanted to look at Ukraine or Crimea in Russian news propaganda. It's probably something you do every day, right? So yeah, I think I'll look at English language Russian news propaganda. Don't worry if you're not doing it. I'm doing it for you. So you would pull down a body of content using keywords, and then you would try to code it. You would try to assign the text to specific categories so you could quantify and qualify how much Russians were pushing a particular narrative about Crimea or Ukraine. And so what Propaganda IQ does is it pulls down an article, you say, yes, this is on a particular narrative, no, this is not. And then it starts suggesting different keywords to you so that it allows you to see relationships in the text that you as a human couldn't see at speed and scale. It does give you some false positives. You do have to keep the human in the loop for a while, which means you can't just let it go off on its own because it's going to get some nonsense words. But it definitely worked and was a step forward. So that was kind of exciting, but you know, I'm just a professor. I'm not in Silicon Valley. So I gave some presentations on Propaganda IQ, and I met these, so I met people at Marvelous AI, which is a small startup in Silicon Valley. And Marvelous AI is in the business of detecting narratives within different types of text. They worked initially mostly with Twitter and now work a lot with news content as well. So I'm a consultant to the company. And when I first started, I was like, we had this meeting and I just gave this presentation and they called me up and they're like, wow, we really need someone like you. I'm like, but you guys can actually code. Like, I'm just a content analysis specialist. How can I help? And they're like, well, we really need to join together. And they had to talk me into it. But it's been an amazing experience, not least because amongst them, they've sort of been involved in foundings of a lot of companies. And I've learned a lot about how that industry works. One of them actually wrote the basis for Siri. So in terms of voice recognition. So that's pretty amazing. So in Marvelous AI, we take a segment of text and we divide it into topics, which we call narratives. And I know Susanna's like chuckling to herself happily there because, what do we mean by narrative? We mean a major thematic way in which people talk about issues such as immigration narratives around build the wall or things like that. That's a whole like nerd fest conversation we can have later if you like. And what's cool about the Marvelous AI system is it is actually, unsurprisingly, it's more robust. So we can take a big body of text, the system divides it into suggested narratives, and then we code about 100 of them, and that'll typically give you a nice, clear narrative. Let's not get wildly excited. You can't really, speech works in such a way and words work in such a way, not everything can be coded as a narrative, but enough can be that you can have some real fun with it, which we did in this story, which I strongly encourage you to download. Don't even read it, just download it because I like to get my stuff downloaded or read it. And it's there and you could just click on that link to get it. There's no paywall. So this is a very sort of vibrant chart, but this is an example of augmented intelligence. So this is sort of taking my ability to know how to code political content and taking their ability to operationalize it at speed and scale. And this is in Twitter. Twitter is a delightful thing to code, by the way. It's pretty easy to code. So as you can see, the bright red is a personal attack. So Biden and Harris, the eventual winners, right? They're getting the most attacked during the primary season for election 2020. And what we found in our paper and what you can see here in general is that women are more likely to be attacked I'm sorry. I was just making sure that the chart actually said what I thought it was going to say. And I'm gonna roll that back a bit. You can see that in terms of supportive narratives on Twitter, Biden had quite a lot. He had more than any other candidate. And Buttigieg actually had quite a few too, considering he was not the most mainstream of candidates. But Klobuchar and Sanders were much more likely to be attacked on policy. What we found overall about women is that women were generally more likely to be attacked on character and not talked about with policy, which is problematic for democracy. And men and women are talked about somewhat differently. But that was an example of doing that. Now this kind of looks like the blob attacking the Enterprise here. And I have a minute and a half. And fortunately, I'm just about done. Woohoo! But here is something that I think is a leap forward in terms of understanding it. So if you look at this 2x2 chart, the top half is going, the further up you go, the more committed the media sources people are tweeting about are to facts. So think of the top of the chart as the fact-based media sphere, and the bottom of the chart is the conspiracy-based media sphere. And then it moves left to right in the predictable pattern. So we used All Sides Media to code the different media sources, and that's a crowdsourced platform that decides whether media lean right, lean left, or center. So we didn't use our own particular bias, which would not have worked particularly well. So as you can see, and this is volume of tweets, the blue tweets being left-leaning and the reddish tweets being right-leaning. And as you can see, those on the left who are tweeting tend to tweet within the fact-based universe, whereas those on the right who are tweeting often skitter down into the conspiracy world. The gray blobs are those that we suspect of bot-like or artificial activity. So what's interesting, and this is I threw in the labeling there. So what's interesting about that is, you know, that's telling you something about an information ecosphere that I can't tell you as a human coder, as a human content analysis. And it's not really comprehensible unless there's elements of that that are put in by people who know the world of media and some other aspects of it. So it's an example of the old versus the new, and hopefully coming out with something that is augmented and is useful. Marvelous AI can now do this at speed, pretty much. So we also did an article on, we did a paper on the 2020 elections in which we looked at Biden versus Trump narratives. And I was looking for Russian propaganda. Instead, I found kind of some right-wing propaganda, but that's a whole nother presentation. And that paper is also available on my website, or linked to on my website, which is at the beginning of these slides. So I think we need to stop talking about in particular whether tech is good or bad. So I'm at 16 minutes. So now I'll take about 3 or 4 minutes to pontificate, because I keep thinking I only have 15, but Susanna told me before I could do 20. And you might go, okay, well, no one talks about whether tech is good or bad, Sarah, but we kind of do. Like, did Parler cause the January 6th insurrection? Is probably not the question we should ask or answer. But the question we should ask or answer is a much broader, deeper one about what particular societal divisions prime the pump, as it were. It's fine to talk about catalysts, but I think that Chris would definitely agree with me that that's too narrow a question, although it's an interesting one. And this is a biggie. And this is why I was really excited to see Chris's presentation and the details about his company today and his process. So I've spent the last 5 or 6 years in 3 different worlds. So I did a year at the Wilson Center, which is very focused on policy and communicating with policymakers. I've been involved in my own small innovation startup, and also with a more robust one in terms of Marvelous AI. So I've been in that world. And of course, I live in the world of academia. These worlds are not talking to each other. And I think the best way they can talk to each other, not to sound like a rabid capitalist or anything, is through innovative products and companies such as Chris's. So I think the way the future is a closer alliance discussion and conversation, which we're already seeing under the Biden administration, but we're not so much seeing at places like Facebook, where academics and other people have been saying for years, hey, we know a lot of ways you can solve the rampant misinformation problems on the world's largest information platform, but they're not open to that. And I think looking forward to the new era and talking about resilience in our information communities, that's really, really important. I think we need augmented intelligence there as well. And I think the next is my final slide. And typical academic slide, right? It's like, these are hard. We need to try. These are complex problems that do not have easy solutions. Misinformation is not a case of, oh, let's teach everyone media lit, or, you know, let's pass a law. These are complicated problems embedded in a lot of different aspects of society. They are not tech problems, nor are they any more completely social problems. We've entered a new era in which tech and society are wedded. And I'm going to end on a sort of advertising note, as it were, for the Soda Center. And that's why I'm enormously excited about it, because I think that kind of thinking that draws together different people from different disciplines to focus on the reality of society and tech is exactly what we need right now. So I will stop sharing, and more importantly, stop talking.
Thank you, Sarah. That was lovely. And thank you also, Chris. I see that one of the questions, there were 2 questions in the Q&A, and Chris Mahoney answered them. I'm not sure if either of them are ones you'd like to raise orally. I will repeat the first one because I personally think it's a great question. How do you account for sarcasm in sentiment analysis? And Chris answers that language data is problematic for that issue, although when engaging some emerging NLP techniques, some patterns in language that indicate sarcasm, can be possible. So there are some techniques for that. And then of course, when audio is employed, you can get tone, and that allows you to detect sarcasm more than just transcribed language. The second question is, in the article Prediction and Explanation in Social Systems, the authors urge computer and social scientists to better characterize theoretical limits to predictive accuracy in complex social systems to set expectations, basically, for what can be predicted or explained. And this questionnaire wanted the speakers to offer their thoughts on how their research work might better characterize it. I'll go ahead and read Chris's answer. Well, Sarah can think if she has an answer to this herself. Chris's answer is that all sorts of specificity can be identified, including geographic specificity is one of the many examples, but also defining the metric of what is being predicted helps to set expectations and prompt further exploration and research. Do you want to elaborate on that, Chris, or Vince?
I mean, I think the other thing to add is just that being perhaps transparent about the limitations also prompts discussion about the theoretical explanations for why those limitations exist, right? So, yeah, I mean, being transparent about theoretical limitations assumes we know, right? And I think that's the great power sometimes of the marrying or the integration of social and data science methodological approaches, is that what we think we know in the social sciences can be vetted, sometimes substantiated, sometimes debunked. And yeah, and so to say, oh, these are the theoretical limitations, if presumes that we have some level of knowledge that it's quite possible that we don't. I think one thing I've learned is to be very cautious in asserting what we think we know about something, because unfortunately for me, at least, my experience is that one ends up, going through a sort of humiliating experience of we think this will be associated with this, and then it's just shown to be, there's something that you never thought about is actually more significant.
Right.
Yeah.
Sarah, yeah.
It's funny because I was talking to someone at the State Department the other day, just casually about, and they were kind of like, well, I sit through all these presentations with these AI companies, and Chris will kind of chuckle about this because sometimes, and they're like, oh, we can do this. I'm going, no, you can't. So yeah, I think I think there are surprising and amazing things you can find once you leverage your human intelligence with data analytics or the power of machine learning or something like that. But I would agree with Chris, it's often not what you expected. And sort of over the years, I've learned to under promise and try to overproduce. There's been a lot of crazy talk in my field, like, oh, Twitter can predict elections. No, Twitter cannot predict elections. It can predict certain things in certain states at certain times on certain issues. Yes. But there's still this kind of weird, like techno dreaming that we can know things that are unknowable through technology. And no, that doesn't work.
So the QA has another question. An anonymous attendee points out that MIT Tech Review recently reported that many of the common AI training data sets are riddled with label errors. And there's a colleague actually recently sent me this article, so that's pretty exciting. And that correcting those other errors has implications for models' accuracies. And the models discussed in that article are things like, is this a duck or a cat? So given that those are relatively straightforward, how worried should we be about AI for complex social phenomena that depend on training data that are even harder to label, like sentiment, conflict, identity, everything that you all study?
Well, I know, Susanna, because you label training data in your free time, right? That I would never trust labeling of a data set unless I went in and looked at it. Or maybe you had done it, but I mean, don't trust but verify. I mean, Chris, what would you say about that?
I mean, it goes to a really constructive and helpful discussion that we're having internally, and that Adam, who kindly introduced me to yourselves, has also prompted about bias, conscious or subconscious. And that's something that's obviously is really consequential. It's just one, though, of many, of many ethical rights and governance issues around what we do. But for us, it's even more important, because when we allow the bias inherent, maybe or disproportionately held by a particular social group to permeate any part of the methodological process, then then we get things wrong, right? Then we don't achieve the same level of geographic specificity or accuracy or explanatory capacity, because we're missing things because we haven't thought to look for them. And so that's why it's sort of critical to our own success to ensure not only that we have the diverse range of disciplinary expertise, but also of lived experiences, right? So if you ever are really having trouble falling asleep, and you can go to our website, which will really bore you with some of the methods and stuff there. But you'll also see that our personnel, have different lived experiences, right, across different continents, different cultures, and that's really important for the interrogation of any assumption underpinning why we might look at one phenomena, and then the metric that might be employed to represent that phenomena, right, in different contexts. So I mean, this is all even before you get to to the start of the design of the data science experiments and all that, and the real curation of the data and stuff like that. But it's critical to us, as well as considering what should we do and what shouldn't we do, right? Because what we do can be used to cause so much harm potentially, right? We can identify specific language configurations, for example, is the example I like to give, that's associated with increase in violence, as well as that language which is associated with decrease in violence. So we're not providing the language associated with increase in violence to clients because they could promote that language, right? Because we're a small entity, right? We don't have the capacity to say, government X, private sector company Y, international organization T, they're good people over there and they would never do this or that. Particularly where entities are large, people come and go. And so and so those are the sort of difficult, the consequences of bias and how it sort of permeates just one of like a plethora of examples that we're trying to think through, because we don't have guidance, right? There's no regulation or law. There's so much we can do within the law, within existing regulation, that would cause enormous harm, but we don't have any constraints, so we try to create them for ourselves.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember the first time Marvelous and I were talking about coding, and I'm like, okay, so we need to write our coding guidelines, and then we need a pilot, and then we're going to have coding meetings, and then we have to write the handbook. And they're like, what? So coding on the face of it, like tagging something as pro Putin or tagging something as pro Biden or whatever. People don't agree on that. And it's I know Susanna's probably laughing because I know you've sat through a lot of like coding disagreement meetings. And so when you code by hand, like every week you sit down with your team of coders and you're like, well, Bobby, I see that you coded it this way, and Susie, you coded it that way. Now let's discuss. And you have to think of a way to do that, that can be done at speed and scale. So it's challenging. And anyone who's done any kind of coding, we don't take it as, it's like, oh, until I see it, till I've seen what you've done. And I would encourage people just in general to do that. For example, if you get any of the sort of there's several very large now social media analytics firms that will sell you sentiment analysis. It's not any of it very good. I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, but it's pretty basic. So yeah, just kind of look at what you're getting.
actually, before I get to Adam Russell's question, I'd actually like to get to Brian Butler's question to the panelists that he put in the panelist chat, which was thoughts on the challenges, risks, ethics of learning about the limitations of social data science by experimentation and trial and error. So this may get to the sort of what's keeping Chris Mahoney up at night, and Sarah Oates as well, one of those issues. The alternate phrasing is, do we need IRB-like review of social data science predictive modeling for community impact?
Did you want to go first, Sarah, or?
Go ahead, Chris. I'm mulling a little.
So I mean, for us, we've set up what we call a preliminary ethics oversight, ethics, rights and governance oversight board. It was originally an ethics oversight board, and it was quickly identified to us by those on the preliminary ethics oversight board that it should be, you know, that there are ethical dimensions to what you do. There are also rights dimensions to what you do. There are different public goods. Sometimes they come into tension, right? So for example, we might identify language that is so significantly related with a dramatic increase in risk of violence. Do we then have an obligation to compromise on another right, the right to privacy, and provide that to whatever the law enforcement agency is in a particular territory? When is that threshold breached, right? Of course, there's nothing giving any guidance on that, but our own perhaps subjective interpretation of what might be, for example, domestic criminal law, which says, you know, if you are party, or if you are witness to any kind of preparation of criminal conduct, then you have an obligation to report it to authorities. But at what point are we witness, right? Yeah, if we went along to an average police station in Chennai or Bangsamoro autonomous region in the Philippines, or some of these other, you know, Eastern DRC, and we said, oh, does this breach the threshold? You know, of course we're going to get blank stares, you know, and so it's a difficult one for us, but one where, again, you know, and it's going back to that point when I was back in 2003, I was 21 years of age there, and that's where I think, you know, I'd taken a year off my undergraduate studies and had that year in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and I remember getting those those minibuses into town. I was, you know, when you're young and not much money, you're living way out, so it's like an hour-long ride in these, and like a daily process of humiliation, right? Where I'd say, oh, I'm going to work at this Truth Commission and we're doing this and that, and, you know, and I think it's going to like have this impact. And of course, you know, I was just doing economics and law back then. And so that was this process of, geez, you haven't thought about this and you really don't understand, you know, the context that you're working in. And so like every day, just like stripped of all the assumptions, like, you know, like getting that same message, you really have no idea. And that's kind of, I think, what prompted, you know, maybe a disciplinary change in my career, but at least an attempt to try to draw from other disciplines, which is still ongoing, and, you know, and really where we have such a long way still to go on the explanatory side. For example, climate in Eastern DRC, we're doing a project where we look at climate-related factors, but then what are the transitory mechanisms between those things and violence, right? There's all this literature about, we see increased level of risk between climate-related natural disasters and change in levels of violence, but what are the transitory mechanisms, under what circumstances specific to that context, right? Both change and like perceptions, change in the commodity prices, you know, that are related to change in agricultural output, you know, which also affected, you know, and then perceptions about all sorts of other things like ethnicity, religion, nationality, all those things. They're just total unknowns, you know, which I think also explains our inability to forecast well, right? Is the fact that we tend to stay in our disciplinary silos. And if you're a climate scientist or an ecologist, you just look at the relationship between that and change and violence, right? Whereas that's the power of machine learning capacities if we really roll our sleeves up and do the hard preliminary social science work of like hypothesizing. Sorry, I rambled a bit there.
It's okay. Sarah, would you like to take a crack at this question? And then I think we'll do Adam Russell's and then Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect we'll be out of time after that.
Thank you, Brian, for a really, really hard question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. One is the privacy paradox, which Alice Marwick and others have talked about. And that is that people put stuff online that they really shouldn't, right? And this becomes an ethical dilemma for a researcher who might know better. And it certainly happened with Parler, where Parler didn't keep the anything that happened on the app safe, and it was completely hacked and then distributed online. So I would say I would not use Parler data, because I would argue that that was not, that violated the rights of the people, what limited rights they have of being on there. But the FBI is using it to arrest people. So there you go. And that segues into my next brief comment, in that I don't know what to do when I'm outmanned and outgunned by social media companies in terms of ethics. They have constantly violated even their very vague and small written ethics to their users. They do not protect their user rights. I, as a researcher, feel like I have a slightly I have a higher bar, but it's very, very hard also when people like the President of the United States are weaponizing social media for their own anti-democratic ends. So that might generate some interesting comments. But the point is that, as a researcher, you're trying to stay ethical in a very unethical environment. And you should, but it's difficult at times.
I'd like to turn now to Adam Russell's question. And given that it's 12:57, I believe this will be the last one. Looking retrospectively, what have you two found with regards to resilience? So places or times where, when your models might have expected violence or dysfunction, but instead the systems or the supply chains actually held. Have you found that those resilient systems have non-intuitive things in common that we can then leverage? So this is the whole, how can we build resilience, or at least understand different kinds of societal, economic, social resilience?
So I'll take the narrower bit, and then maybe Chris can take the wider bit. So I study the flow of news. In particular, I'm interested in how it jumps the tracks between social media and what we would consider traditional media, so broadcasters, newspapers, radio. On January 6th, the American democracy was far more resilient than you would have predicted from what was going on in social media. Institutions still matter. Crisis still matters. So I would agree. I would look at how these systems predict and function in times of crisis, because I think it's different from how we would predict things in more normal times. In that sense, social media is a reflection and a refraction of society, but there are deeper roots, which is more Chris's work, in society that ground us and keep things from being as derailed as they might be. And I don't know, Chris, is that your experience, or?
Well, yeah. Yet again, I'll be quite hesitant to kind of make any predictions about resilience. Say, for example, in America, we're about to start the development of models for some US cities. So that will be interesting. So yeah, for example, real incomes, where that's going. I mean, all these sorts of different indicators of division, across social groups, geographies, all that sort of stuff. But say in that Kenya model I just showed, one thing, and maybe I'm showing a gendered bias here, but everyone in our team neglected to think of this, was the significant association of language about women's rights, women's reproductive rights, for example, and decline in levels of violence, right? So maybe, I don't know. Again, this is me hypothesizing. Maybe there's a significant relationship between levels of toxic masculinity, the permissiveness of discourse for that, and its decline, and levels of different forms of violence, right? Because remember, we were looking at like political violence, riots, and protests, not necessarily, and it's so hard to get data on this, it's like representative data, domestic violence, sexual and gender-based violence, for example, that's not part of an armed conflict. So again, this is just me hypothesizing, but as always, you start to uncover the potential significant relationships that, as we now begin to do take a much more sophisticated approach in that particular context in Kenya, we might be able to vet that hypothesis a bit more amongst so many. I mean, there's so many others, we don't have time to go into so many of them, and we don't know how context specific they are, right? Across different neighborhoods, one neighborhood to another in Mombasa, let alone Mombasa to Nairobi, let alone you go up into like a demographically sparse location like the Rift Valley, but where there's also, significant natural resource deposits that there are contestations over, for example. So yeah, suffice to say, much more to come on this, but I think we're at the kind of starting point where sort of context specific resilience, and that's the other thing we do, is we don't just look at the historical factors, we also provide to the client the change in the configuration of those factors contemporaneously, right? So another thing sometimes us in our disciplinary silos tend to err on is taking an explanation saying, oh, this is going to be consistent, whereas the relationship between perception and all sorts of configurations of change in reality is always changing, right? So how do we know that these findings that are often snapshots in time persist?
Speaking of starting points, this is also a stopping point. Where, though I would like to point out, there was one question for Mr. Mahoney about any published work on the DRC project. So this might be a good opportunity to put it in the chat that says to panelists and attendees, so that Gloria and Zeka can see if you have anything there, or if you have anything on your website. Brian, I think it looks like you have something to say.
Sarah, I think the final slide. Yep. So thank you again for joining us for the SOTA Symposium. If you're interested in kind of getting notifications, announcements about future SOTA events, we're going to have an additional SOTA Symposium on, I believe it's May 11th. So I'll say early May. It's the second Tuesday in May, on sampling and data gathering in social media streams. And we have some different folks to talk about that from different perspectives. So again, we'd love to have you join us for that. If you'd like information about that, or information about how to become a SOTA Center affiliate, feel free to send us a note at socialdatascience@umd.edu. You can also follow things just at socialdatascience.umd.edu on the web. And thank you for joining us. And thank you very much, Sarah and Chris, for the really interesting presentation. And
Thank you.
glad everybody
Thank
could
you
make it.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for hosting us. Such a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you.